So if I show you a picture, I hope you're going to recognize that pretty quickly. That's a USB-C type connector. That's one of the USB kind of logos. And if we kind of click through some other photos here, we're going to see again that logo there, and then this is a USB-A kind of connector. Here's a laptop with some USB-A, maybe USB-C there, and there's another USB-C. So the common factor, of course, is USB. So today we're going to be looking at USB. So USB, the universal serial bus, and specifically today we're going to be looking at USB 3.0, 3.1, 3.2, and 4.0. Now, USB universal, it is universal. I mean, you can basically find it everywhere. You can find it on, computers, obviously, on televisions, on cameras, on all kinds of things. So it really is used in all kinds of electronic gadgets in our life. And way back in the day, USB was pretty simple. There was USB 1. We knew that was the slow one, and there was USB 2. We knew that was the high speed one, and that was all you needed to know. But things have got a little more complicated since then. Now we've got USB 3, 3.1, 3.2, and 4. And to make things worse, the USB governing body decided to rename some of the older standards under the newer specifications. So for example, USB 3 and USB 3.2 Gen 1 X1 are actually the same thing. Now we'll get more to this in a minute, so let's try to unravel some of these mysteries. Okay, so let's just go into this naming fiasco. So originally in 2008 we had USB 3.0 and it supported up to 5 gigabits a second data transfer rate. Then a few years later we had USB 3.1. Now the problem with USB 3.1 is it renamed some of the things that we found in USB 3. So USB 3.0 was named to be USB 3.1 Generation 1. And then you had USB 3.1 Generation 2, which was the new stuff, and that added support for up to 10 gigabits per second. So USB 3.0 got dismissed and you get USB 3.1 Gen 1 and Gen 2. But it doesn't stop there, because then we had USB 3.2 in 2017 and that renamed things as well. So USB 3.0 and USB 3.1 Gen 1, which were the same thing, is now called USB 3.2 Gen 1 X1. And USB 3.1 Gen 2, remember that's the 10 gigabyte one here, that now gets called USB 3.2 Gen 2 X1. And then we have some new stuff. We get USB 3.2 Gen 1 X2, which supports 10 gigabits a second. We'll talk more about how that works in a second. And then finally you get USB 3.2 Gen 2, which now supports 20 gigabits a second. Did I say gigabytes a second? Then I meant to say gigabits. So what's all this X1, X2 business? So basically the X2 bit at the end means there's a second data lane and therefore doubles the maximum transfer rate. So USB 3.2 Gen 1 X1 is basically USB's 3.05 gigabits a second without a second lane, so it's 5 gigabits a second. USB 3.2 Gen 2 X1 is basically USB 3.1 Gen 2's 10 gigabits a second without a second lane, so it's 10 gigabits a second. But USB 3.2 Gen 1 X2 is in fact USB 3.0's 5 gigabits a second, but with a second data lane, so now it's 10 gigabits a second. So there's a difference there. That 10 gigabits a second and this are not the same thing. This is actually USB 3 with 2 data lanes, and this is USB 3.1 Gen 2 without a second data lane. But as you can imagine, there's also a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, which is actually USB 3.1 Gen 2's 10 gigabits a second, but with a second lane, so you get 20 gigabits a second. So you get 5, 10 and 20, and these two 10s are actually two different things, one with 2 lanes and one without. So I hope that's all nice and clear for you. And just to see that in a kind of graphical form here, here's a chart from a similar article that you'll find about this subject on the Android Authority website. And you can basically see, as I said, USB 1 was the slow one, USB 2 we thought was the fast one, but then things have kind of gone up 5, 10, 20. And when we get to talk about USB 4 in a minute, we'll talk there's 40 gigabits a second. In fact, there's now 80 gigabits a second, and we'll talk about that as you go along. So obviously, this is pretty amazing that we're getting these kind of speeds down some copper wire. We're not talking about optic fiber, we're not talking about anything like that. This is down copper wire. So this is pretty amazing that we can get these kind of speeds. So let's talk about USB 4. That came out in 2019. Now, USB 4 is a completely different beast to the ones that we've seen previously. It's based on Thunderbolt 3. Now, Thunderbolt was something that was created by Intel, very much used by Apple in conjunction with Intel on the Mac products, and they gave the Thunderbolt 3 protocol to the USB governing body. That's the USB IF Implementers Forum. And so it's also, USB 4 is also aligned with the Thunderbolt 4 specification. The Thunderbolt 4 is basically Thunderbolt 3, but it boosts up some of the minimum requirements, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So the key difference in Thunderbolt 4 and Thunderbolt 3 are a minimum bandwidth requirement of 32 gigabits per second for the PCI Express link. You have to support multiple 4K displays using DisplayPort 1.4, and USB 4 support is required in Thunderbolt 4. What does that mean? You can plug a USB 3.2 device into a Thunderbolt 3 device, and the Thunderbolt 3 will understand it, but you can't plug a Thunderbolt 3 into a USB 3.2. But with USB 4, you can plug USB 4 into Thunderbolt or Thunderbolt into USB. So it's kind of full levels of compatibility that we get there. And USB 4 products must support 20 gigabits a second as a minimum, and then they do support up to 40 gigabits a second, as I said. In fact, that's now gone up as well. In fact, in 2022, there was another revision of USB 4.0. The specification was updated, added 80 gigabits in a bidirectional mode, 120 gigabits a second in an asymmetric mode, and up to 80 gigabits per second operation utilizing a new physical layer architecture based on a PAM3 signal encoding over the, this is the important thing what I want to point out, over the existing 40 gigabits per second USB Type-C passive cables. So that's the good thing. You can use the older cables with this, or with a new 80 gigabits a second USB Type-C active cables. But wait, there is more. It doesn't just end here. We haven't even started to look at the different connectors. At the beginning there I showed you the USB-A, and of course there's micro B and everything. But let's just say everything really now is revolving around Type-C. Type-C really is the universal connector. It works for USB 4, it works in USB 3.2, it works for Thunderbolt 3, it works for Thunderbolt 4, and you can carry things like video signals over it, so you can plug your monitors in using USB-C as well. So that's because USB 4 supports other types of data. It doesn't have to have only the Thunderbolt and the USB data going over it. It can have DisplayPort in alternative mode. And so, for example, on a Mac, which we'll talk more about in a minute, you can actually plug an external monitor in using USB-C, not only a Mac, on other laptops as well. And of course, it supports Thunderbolt 3 and PCI Express functionality, as you find built in there to the Thunderbolt specification. And then on top of all that, which we're not even going to go into today, there's a mind-boggling number of power options for charging and for powering monitors and laptops and so on via the USB power delivery system. And we will just mention that briefly. There's one slide I wanted to show you some logos that kind of try to kind of make some sense of all that, which I'll show you in a minute. So let's look at a real world example. The MacBook Air with the M1 processor has two Thunderbolt/USB 4 ports on it. What does that mean? Well, you can use that port for charging. You can use that port for DisplayPort, so you can plug in an external monitor. You can use it for a Thunderbolt 3 connector up to 40 gigabits a second. You can use it for USB 4 up to 40 gigabits a second, same thing really. And you can use it for USB 3.1 Gen 2 for up to 10 gigabits a second. Now notice there Apple, this is directly from Apple specification. They didn't go with the USB 3.2 Gen 1 X1 naming scheme. They just said no, that we're just sticking with the USB 3.1 Gen 2. And then if you look at the newer Macs, the Mac Mini M2 has two Thunderbolt 4 ports. Now it specifically says Thunderbolt 4. Now I wanted to mention the difference there. So it says Thunderbolt 4 again, but if you look at the things, it's the same thing really. 40 gigabits a second, 40 gigabits a second, 10 gigabits a second there, and then two USB-A ports, 5 gigabits a second. So that's the USB 3.0 original thing. And there, if you look at the back there, what do you get? Well, obviously power and Ethernet. There are your two ports. There's HDMI, and those are the two USB-A ports. So out of these two ports, you can connect a display as well as other USB and Thunderbolt devices. Now, that's what I wanted to show you the difference, is because the difference is that USB on the M1 you can only display one display, on the M2 you can have two displays, and therefore that makes it compatible with Thunderbolt 4. And that's why this says Thunderbolt 3 and this says Thunderbolt 4. That's the main difference. But in terms of the underlying stuff, it's the Thunderbolt is Thunderbolt. So there you go. Hope that helps clear up some of that. So if you are shopping for a Mac or a PC or a laptop and you're a bit confused about, well, does it support Thunderbolt? Does it support USB 3.2 or is it USB 4? Hopefully now you can kind of understand what they're talking about there. Now, of course, the USB people finally did realise that they've kind of really confused everybody with this. So, you know, all this USB, so look here, USB 3 was actually USB 3.1 Gen 1, was actually USB 3.2 Gen 1, actually it's 5 megabits a second. So what they've done now is they've got this new naming here, USB 1, USB 2, and now they're calling it USB 5 gigabits per second, USB 10 gigabits a second, USB 20 gigabits a second, USB 20 gigabits a second, USB 40 gigabits a second, and USB 80 gigabits. And that's pretty good, especially if it's carrying one of the certified logos, particularly when you're talking about cables or something, you're not buying one from a cheap kind of manufacturer from China, you're getting proper certified cables. I think this does help kind of, you know, the normal person just work out the higher the number, the better the port. But again, noting here, for example, there's a difference between USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, which is basically the 10 gigabits a second with 2 data lanes, and the USB 4 20 gigabits a second, because that's basically Thunderbolt. So this is USB 3.2, okay, with 2 data lanes. So actually really that's USB 3.1 Gen 2, okay, but then double the speed because it's got 2 data. But this is Thunderbolt, okay, and upwards, USB 4 upwards is all Thunderbolt based stuff. But it can carry inside of it, tunneling they call it, carry inside of it the older ones, and it can also tunnel inside of it things like a monitor and things like that. Now, one other side I wanted to show you, and that is for all of the power cables. So they've also brought out some logos here just to show you the number of watts it can take. So you can get, for example, a 5 gigabits a second cable, but it can do charging at 240 watts, or maybe, you know, 5 gigabits a second for only 60 watts. So you do get these different combinations here that try to combine both what you can turn in terms of power and data speed. Of course, obviously, when you're putting more power in it, the cable's going to need to be thicker and other things going on there, shielding and all other kind of stuff they need, because you've got all that power going through it, not just data at a lower voltage. So those are the things to watch out for. So if you see one of these labels, one of these logos, you can pretty much guess what it is and understand pretty quickly what it is that you're seeing. Okay, that's it. My name's Gary Sims. This is Gary Experience. I really hope you enjoyed this quick video just trying to unpack some of the mysteries here of the USB standards. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. You can also follow me on all of the trendy and not so trendy social media networking sites. There are all my handles on the screen. And if you like these kind of videos, I invite you to stick around by subscribing to the channel. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.